Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to be here. I'm here just for the day, and I've been hearing a little bits and pieces about what's been happening at the fair. Congratulations for this multi-decade now annual fair, and thank you so much to MREA for inviting me. I want to begin by just telling you what you should call me when you ask me questions. This funny nickname I have is Jay. It stands for Janet. Please just call me Jay. You get used to it after 4 or 5 times. And I'm here to talk to you today about how we are achingly close to a renewable energy revolution within a couple of years that does not require new policy. Most of it is already in place, and that we can move forward even if the crazies continue in the House of Representatives after November. And maybe more important and more broadly, things have changed utterly since I first started hearing about energy and studying energy in the early 1980s. So for anyone here, for anyone you know who maybe hasn't thought about energy and kind of fixed in their mind their thoughts about energy in the 1970s, please remind them that it is time to clear their minds of those long-gone truths and facts, because they have been replaced with new economics, new realities, and much more positive vision going forward. And I'm going to be telling you about some of those things today. First, I want to credit the title I took for this talk came from an essay, an op-ed by Dr. Paul Krugman in the New York Times. Maybe some of you saw it. He's my favorite economist who's willing to write for the popular media. Paul Krugman, on February 1st, had a column in the New York Times called Wind, Sun, and Fire. It's still online. You can see it. And he was talking in the column about what's really at stake in this election. I'm not going to be talking specifically about that today, but you'll see lots of references to why policy leadership really matters. I will be talking to you about what's at stake in terms of climate. We know that we've had record warmth. Every year that's a new year is record for warmth. And anyone here who's younger, who's 31 years of age or younger, or has a child or grandchild that age, every one of those people, every month that they have been alive for 31 years, has broken the record for the last century in heat globally. And that is not modeled data. That's thermometer readings from across the globe. So I hope that you will not let any politician ever suggest that there's a hoax that's going on, or that global warming is not real, because it is. Global warming is real. It's being caused mostly by us. The impacts are being felt even now in every country around the globe, and no one will escape from global warming, especially low-income populations in every country. And then number 5, what we do today matters and makes a difference. So that's what I want to talk about today. Unfortunately, if there were no prospect for effective action on renewable energy and addressing climate, the election would not matter. But as I've alluded to, things have really moved forward quickly. So I'm going to first introduce to you my company, which is called Fresh Energy. It's a private, nonprofit, or non-governmental organization. We're 25 years old this year. And we were formed by Minnesotans in Minnesota to work in Minnesota, in the Midwest, in the nation, on driving clean energy policies that benefit everyone, that benefit all. And we were driven by the hard reality. Actually, the people who started Fresh Energy did not include me. I joined in 1995. And the people who got together in Minnesota were mothers, grandfathers. There was a lead wind energy staff person in the state of Minnesota. I think the only wind energy staff person in the state of Minnesota. There was one solar energy staff person in the state of Minnesota. And then there were people from all of the many colleges and universities. And they were just really concerned that the US Department of Energy was very clear 25 years or more ago, that Minnesota has enormous prospects for developing homegrown wind energy, solar energy, and energy efficiency. and that they were also very stunned to learn that Minnesota instead was spending $25 billion a year on energy and sending most of it out of state to bring in very dirty sources of energy. And they wanted to change those economics, and they wanted to have a rebalance. They wanted to have much less global warming pollution, much less carbon pollution, cleaner air and cleaner water, and they wanted to do that while keeping more dollars in Minnesotans and in Americans' pocketbooks and in their local economies going forward. And so now we can fast forward 25 years, and I'm going to talk to you about how things have utterly changed and that we know the directionality of what works going forward. So that's Fresh Energy. And another way to think about it is we are a data-driven, science-based organization. I am the staff scientist, essentially. I'm a climatologist by training. I taught at George Washington University for a couple of years in Washington, D.C., and I found myself gravitating toward energy policy, climate policy classes. And I have always been very interested in applied research, and so I found a way, and I found a company, Fresh Energy, that was doing that work, applying best research to getting action that would make a difference on the landscape. So we are about keeping more dollars in the state, clean water and clean air, and efficiency, wind, and solar energy going forward. We see this country as a nation of laws, and we knew, the founders of Fresh Energy knew, that you had to have a level playing field in the laws to make sure that clean energy could systematically transform and replace conventional sources of energy, that we had to move forward together. I'm going to start with this slide and tell you the story behind this slide. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see some of the images today, but this is me, actually, I'm a little shocked still, on August 3rd of 2015, in the Blue Room of the White House with President Obama. Not my usual work day. And I'm going to talk about the two gentlemen who happen to be between us in the photo, but I'm going to tell you how this came to be. This is an emblem not of me or not even of Fresh Energy, but this shot is an emblem of the importance of the Midwest, and I'll explain to you why that is. This was the day that President Obama, a little bit later after he had a meeting with 12 of us in the Blue Room, he went down the hall with us to the East Room of the White House, which is where he does press conferences, where the national TV cameras were, and gave a formal announcement of the Clean Power Plan. And there were 300 people in that room. And he was announcing the Clean Power Plan. I'll be talking about that. If you don't know, it's the biggest thing any nation on Earth has ever done to fight global warming, and it is the law of the states in the United States. So he was announcing that. But beforehand, he wanted to have a little reception. And he wanted specifically to have people in the White House with him who were from outside the Beltway. He wanted people from outside the Beltway who were with organizations that had been working on carbon reduction and building our economy around clean energy jobs, because he knows that what matters most to what happens in Washington, D.C. is, unfortunately, or fortunately, not really what happens in California, not really what happens in Vermont. It's not a coastal thing. It's the heartland states that have historically been very dependent on coal and oil, and those states making the transition that is really the lever that moves things forward. So just a little background to this slide. 4 days before this, I was coming back to the Twin Cities from Duluth, Minnesota. I was meeting with an editorial board up there. I pulled off to a rest area to do a conference call. Many of you probably have jobs like I do, where there's lots of conference calls. So I pulled off to the rest area, did my conference call, and before I got back on I-35, I thought, well, I better check my messages at work. And I had the most indistinct voicemail message I've ever heard. I had to listen to it several times on the side of the highway. And what I could hear loud and clear, I could hear about one out of every 3 words, and what I heard was, White House, President Obama, next week, let us know by the end of today. So that kind of got my attention. And of course I thought, well, you probably thought somebody's pulling my leg on this one. And then there was a 10-digit phone number, of which I could discern 9 digits. Play that game by the side of the road. So I'm writing it down kind of with a stick in the ground, and I had a blank for that missing digit, and I thought, well, I can try all the permutations of that number. But first I sent email to whoever I knew who might know if this was really an invitation or not, or what's up. So I had those emails out, and then I tried every permutation and finally got through on the phone, and the number that worked read Valerie Jarrett. Now, I was not talking to Ms. Jarrett at the time. I was talking to one of her assistants, and I do not know her still, but I did know that she's the best friend of President Obama. So I thought, well, this sounds pretty real. And the person said, the president would like to gather, the president, as you know, and I did know because I've been working on the Clean Power Plan, next week is releasing the Clean Power Plan, the final form, and he would love to have a small group of individuals from interesting states join him in the White House. Can you make it? And I said, I would love to make it. What day is it? She said, we don't know yet. So meanwhile, I had to change. I was actually doing a week-long camp on climate action that next week, so I was busy making changes in my schedule. And the next day, I got an email from the White House that said it's Monday at 12:30, and gave me directions for what gate to come through. So I made my plans. I was really happy that the outfit I had was red, because in the group photo from those 12 people, I'm the only one wearing red. So it's very, if you ever get invited to the White House, wear a bright color, because everyone else is wearing a dark suit. So that was Monday. I was just going to fly out. Remember, I work for a nonprofit, so I was going to fly out that morning. Fortunately, flights were cheap. Fly out at 6 or 7 in the morning, fly back late that night. And Sunday night, I was at home packing, getting ready for the trip, and I got another call from inside the White House on Sunday night. Again, this is not my typical day. And things have really gone back to normal after that. But I returned that call, and it was somebody who said, ignore those instructions we gave you for going to the southeast gate. We want you to go to the northeast gate because we got you in a smaller group. Sounds good, but I still didn't know really what to expect. I got to the White House, and there were just 12 of us in the room. And of course, the president was running late. Presidents, like many of us, run late. So we had a half an hour before the president was able to join us, and we were doing meet and greets around the room. The very first person I saw in the room who I recognized, though I did not know him, was the guy in the blue tie there. His name is Ben Folk. Does anyone know who he is? He is the CEO of Xcel Energy. So when you hear a little bit more about what I do for a living, you'll know why I thought, well, this was worth the plane ticket right on its own to have 30 minutes with the CEO of Xcel Energy, which I did have, and I went right over and introduced myself to Ben Folk. And so in case you're not a customer of Xcel Energy is the 4th largest electric utility in the nation. It operates in 8 states, including parts of Wisconsin, about half of Minnesota, and they have historically been a very coal-dominant company. So I knew that everyone in that room was a supporter of national action to cut carbon and of carbon regulation, and just seeing the CEO of Xcel Energy in the room made me know that we had won. So we had a very interesting conversation about how the policy would work, and then the president came in, and we had about 17 minutes with the president. And the guy between Ben Folk and myself, his name is Hal Wimmer. He is the president of the American Lung Association nationally. And he is based in Illinois, another Midwesterner. So this is a Midwest story, a Midwest advocate, a Midwest health advocate, and the CEO of the biggest utility company, I think, in the Midwest, all together to celebrate the Clean Power Plan going forward. And at the same time, remember in that next room, 300 people are waiting for the formal announcement, like 300 really important people, the CEO of the Sierra Club, U.S. senators, including Al Franken, and as they have all come into the room, they see 2 rows left empty in the front, and they're wondering, who are those chairs for? And so it was really fun when we people from the hinterlands came in and sat down. We were getting texts from our friends in the back of the room saying, how did you get up there? And the truth, and the president was very clear. He was talking about Sasha and Malia's future. He was totally up to speed on this policy. He was angry already that some people in the media were saying bad things about it, although they hadn't read it. because it hadn't been released. And so he was very clear that this is a health-based policy that is supported by millions of health professionals, the American Lung Association, and forward-thinking utility companies going forward. And it was the policy that he and his staff were going to bring to Paris for the international climate negotiations. So I want to tell you more of that story. Remember that when you think about climate change, you want to think about everyone on this planet being in this. Absolutely everyone is in this. And this is a slide I use with permission from the President's science advisor who's on leave from Harvard University. His name is John Holdren. I imagine he'll be going back to Harvard in a few months. And he just reminds people who maybe aren't as familiar with how climate affects everything like we Midwesterners are, of all of the things that are impacted by climate, and that he just says climate change puts all of these things at greater risk. So that is why. And so I won't read these to you, but for most people I know, they're all important, and especially maybe the first two, food and water availability going forward. And this is the only other climate science slide I'll show you, because this is why it matters today. Carbon dioxide has a long lifespan in the atmosphere, much longer than water vapor. We know that water vapor cycles in the hydrologic cycle pretty rapidly. And so I carpooled out here today from St. Paul, Minnesota in our Prius. So we were getting about 48 miles per gallon, but we were still putting carbon dioxide molecules into our atmosphere. And statistically, what this graph shows is 1,000 years from today, and now I'm going to put a new header on this graph, that number at top, 3016, get used to that. That's a year. That's a year, that's 1,000 years from now, and 19% of the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere today will still be there trapping heat 1,000 years from now. And so does it matter what choices we make today? And does it matter on a very large scale what choices we make about how we produce our power and how we do transportation and all of industry? Absolutely. So that's what grounds me going forward. Now, as Nick mentioned, I was in Paris. I was representing Fresh Energy at the 21st Climate Summit of international bodies. And so if you're not aware, way back in 1982, the US signed a climate treaty. We are part of the climate treaty that's called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And here's what that treaty says. The nations of the world will work together to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. And they went on to define that as interference with food and water supplies in particular, but also fragile ecosystems as well. So we are party to that. And 20 times before the group of 40,000 people came to Paris, every year the diplomats had met. And they'd reached an impasse every single time. And they had a different way forward this year. And I want to tell you a little bit about what came out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Here's what it looked like inside. Maybe you can, if you are close to the screen, you can tell these are temporary walls. When we flew into Paris, remember, again, I work for a nonprofit, so my flight was a cheaper flight on Thanksgiving Day, which is actually a really good time to fly because nobody else is on the plane. It's very cheap. We arrived on Thanksgiving and we went immediately to Le Bourget Airport. Does that name mean anything to anyone who studies history? That's the airport where Charles Lindbergh landed after his solo flight in 1927. So a really nice piece of history and another connection to Minnesota going forward. It's not been an airport for a long time. It's just a series of concrete slabs. So they erected a temporary facility for 40,000 people for 2 weeks. Nobody slept there except some of the diplomats, but it was where all the sessions were held. I was there from at least 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day for 17 days. And there were plywood walls, plywood floors. They had to bring in modular bathrooms. You'll appreciate this if you've been camping out. They had to bring in modular bathrooms enough for 40,000 people. And plus there were no water pipes. So underneath the plywood floor, there were the water pipes running. And then you can imagine 40,000 diplomats and media people want to be connected to the rest of you. And so there were lots of power cords as well. I said we were there for 17 days. The conference officially ended after 12 days. It didn't reach its resolution until after the 13th day. So on day 13, which was a Saturday, all of the vendors who were, because their contracts were done. So you were lucky if you brought your own food, and there were just these plywood walls and a few wires hanging down going forward. So it wasn't the lap of luxury, but it was an amazing feat for the city of Paris and for the country of France to pull together. I just want to remind you that this historic negotiation happened 2 weeks after the Paris terrorist attacks. The city was then still under a state of emergency. And I had never seen anything like this. Everywhere we went throughout the entire metropolitan area was artwork, demonstrations, films being produced, people coming together to hold symposia about climate change the entire time. So it wasn't just the 40,000 diplomats and people watching them, it was the entire community going forward. Everyone was very grateful to the diplomats from France and was congratulating them. Sometimes they got standing ovations, which doesn't usually happen at a UN summit, because they were doing such a good job of bringing people together in a way that they could reach agreement. And in fact, after one standing ovation, the leader got up and she said, well, we French have been doing diplomacy for 350 years, we better be good at it. But interestingly too, President Hollande, the day after the attacks, he's still doing everything, I'm sure he hasn't slept. The first thing he did was to contact the UN, because there were 40,000 people expected in 2 weeks. And he needed the go-ahead from the UN that they were still going to hold the climate summit. The UN decided very quickly, and to their credit, that climate change was such an important issue. They've been working 3.5 years toward this gathering of diplomats, that they were going to go forward. But President Hollande knew that he had 154 presidents and heads of state scheduled to come the first day of the conference. So the first thing I'm told he did was he got on the phone to all 154 presidents and said, I know you've RSVP'd yes. We're going to be, as you know, in an emergency situation. We cannot guarantee your safety. We would understand if you have to change your RSVP to no. Nobody backed out. 154 heads of state came. And it was because not only those heads of states and diplomats from all, actually 196 countries who were there, had been working for years toward this. You may have seen a year before Paris, headlines in every paper in the country talking about how the US and the Chinese government had reached bilateral agreements on climate. President Obama and President Xi, working together, had said a couple of things to each other and put it out there publicly, that they were going to go to Paris and get an agreement that met the needs of science, and that they were going to bilaterally do things in their own country that in a transparent way to cut carbon. So that had never happened before. And then there were civil society actions. Maybe some of you were at the big march, 300, 400,000 people in New York, months before this, and many marches and protests and vigils held by people of faith, farmers, businesses, leaders from all nations on earth calling for action at the Paris Climate Summit. And then there were state leadership actions. Remember, about 5 months before this, I was in the White House. Minnesota was in the White House with our biggest utility, with the American Lung Association, to announce action on climate. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So this was an astonishing level of convergence going forward. And part of it was that now that we used to quibble, back in the 70s, people used to say, naysayers used to say, you can either choose between having a strong economy or good health. You can't have both. You can't do what you're trying to do with a clean energy transition. And it turns out that over and over again, they've been shown to be wrong. Of course, we can decouple and have economic development right alongside cleaner air and cleaner water and much less global warming pollution. Yes. So in Paris, 2 weeks, the very first day was the 154 heads of state. And we found out, I didn't know this until it was actually happening in front of me, and I was way back in the back of this giant room where the 154 heads of state came in. And remember, it's a temporary room. It's a little more sturdy than this tent, but not too much more. We were lucky that there weren't any storms, and we were lucky that it wasn't very cold. Much bigger than this. And it was the biggest gathering of presidents of countries in one room in one day ever. Ever. And it wasn't at the UN in New York. It was about climate. So it was a very strong signal of universal agreement that we needed to get things done. I was there for trainings before the conference happened, and people who had been to 20 or 21 of these previous climate negotiations were saying, this is the first time we're hearing from the Chinese delegation that losing at Paris means that we don't have an agreement coming out. The Chinese delegation going into the conference saying we must have an agreement means that things are really utterly changing going forward. So the heads of state got together, and this was very fun to watch. And I was listening closely because I don't ever have a chance to get to see 154 heads of state. I didn't have binoculars, but I should have. They were way up front. First of all, it was really funny to see them jockey for position for the group photo. Who you're going to be standing next to for posterity, right? Who wants to stand next to President Putin? I can't remember who wound up there. But that was just funny to see. And then they all, because they'd all traveled from the ends of the globe, they all got 3 minutes to speak. And they all took longer than 3 minutes, every one of them. But I was listening really closely. I was thrilled and just enthralled by what was happening. For the first time ever, there was a group of that many leaders talking about climate change. Every single one of them was talking about impacts on lowest income people in their country. Every one of them, there were no climate denialist statements made. None. So the president of Nigeria, President Putin, were all talking about the need to act for the least among us. Another sign that things had totally changed. And then the second week of the conference, 10 US senators came to Paris for 2 days. And one of those senators was from the Midwest. Senator Al Franken was there to represent the US. Here is what the US had a pavilion. You can see there was this giant sphere that they could project environmental data on, which was fascinating. It's called Science on a Sphere, and then behind them the image of the Grand Canyon. This is all the stuff that got taken down before the last day. So this space was all empty for diplomats to talk. Here's what the outside of it looked like. Here is what one of the panels actually announcing the agreement. And you'll see lots of people, if you're close enough, you can see lots of people from African and small island nations, diplomats who are taking photos because they want to record that this is an astonishing level of agreement going forward. And here is what that agreement came down to. The world now has a call to stabilize the global temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, what scientists say is the minimum threshold for safety for the planet, and to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the second half of this century. And most of the discussion was about doing that early in the second half of this century. So now what we see is forward-thinking communities like Madison, Wisconsin. Anyone here from Madison? I understand, I think I'm getting the date right, on June 7th, 19 out of 20 city council members from Madison, I think Repower Madison did this, voted that Madison now has a goal to get 80% carbon reduction by 2050. So, and we're seeing that from cities all across the US. So essentially, negotiators have called for an end to the fossil fuel era by the middle of this century. This has never happened before on Earth. They also agreed to mobilize at least $100 billion annually in funding to support the low-carbon transition in developing countries, to get around the very real problem that partly why Paris was a success is that the marketplace has changed so that the clean energy solutions are now at least available to the richest nations or the richest people in every nation. But let me tell you, every single conversation that I saw or was a part of in Paris was about how to make sure those low-carbon energy solutions were available to everyone on Earth. That is our mission going forward. Other things notably that had never happened before, There were notable calls for urgent action from several formerly very recalcitrant nations, including China, Russia, Australia, and Canada. Recent elections in two of those nations, Canada and Australia, had tossed out prime ministers who had actively sought to slow international climate progress. This was not very long after Justin Trudeau was elected, and he was there, and that was probably the most popular entourage to be a part of walking around Paris. I did not happen to see them then. Bill Gates was in Paris. Bill Gates was there. Why was Bill Gates in Paris? Bill Gates can afford whatever energy he wants. Bill Gates was there to announce the creation of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, the largest ever multi-billion-dollar clean energy fund, and he brought other billionaires with him. They were there because they know that now not only can they afford it, they can afford it, but they can make money off of it. And so that should be a signal to you that the private sector is now very much engaged in the clean energy revolution. The Indian and French prime ministers, Modi and Hollande, respectively, launched an international solar alliance to raise $1 trillion to make solar affordable in the sun-rich, less developed countries of the world. The African Union rolled out a plan to deliver at least 300 gigawatts of renewable energy to their continent by 2030. That's twice the amount of energy currently generated in all of Africa combined. And then get this, 53 global companies, including Apple, Google, IKEA, Microsoft, Philips, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Walmart, announced their plans to shift to 100% renewable energy. The companies call it RE100, and it has helped rally and that initiative has helped rally many other pledges, and they see this as the beginning of the wave of private sector commitments to go to 100% renewable. I'll talk more about the CEO of Xcel Energy a little bit later, but the other reason the CEO of Xcel Energy is interested in the clean energy transition is he's hearing about it from his very biggest customers, and what he is hearing is those businesses want 100% renewable energy, and they want it tomorrow. They do not want a transition period, they want it as quickly as possible. And then, in addition, in Paris, there were statements or representatives from 1,700 health associations. So we have new friends in this climate movement who are professional doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, hospitals. And they brought with them signatures from 13 million doctors and health professionals, along with 8,200 hospitals, about the healthcare challenge and the need for international movement going forward. So it was very much not business as usual in Paris, and the results were very great. So here is the commitment announced on the Eiffel Tower, and now countries of the world, you may have heard that on Earth Day this year, over 170 countries have actually signed their intent to ratify the Paris Agreement. We were watching, my colleagues and I over the course of the day from the UN, those signatories. Maybe you saw in the paper Secretary Kerry with one of his granddaughters, beautiful image. But many people came forward, and probably the most surprising, and I bet that whoever is assigned to sit next to this person at the UN has never seen him there before. Guess who else signed the Paris Agreement on Earth Day? North Korea. Now, the North Korea representative, I'm told, when he came to the podium to sign, he wasn't trying to get camera attention. He wasn't waving to the camera, but he very quietly came up there and signed. So things have utterly changed. Here is the president. Every country had to bring domestic level commitments to Paris. Here is what the US brought. First of all, we brought for the first time street cred. I was at one of these international negotiations exactly 10 years before, the only other time I've been able to go. It was embarrassing to be an American 10 years ago because the United States has historically contributed most of the pollution that was in the atmosphere and hadn't taken any serious action at that point. I remember sitting down and having very painful conversations with delegations, especially of young people, from small island nations, from sub-Saharan African nations, from Asian nations, who would listen to me talk about the promise of renewable energy in the Midwest, and then they would rightly call me out on the floor for it. They would say, Jay, until the richest nation on earth takes action to get the price point of clean energy technologies down to the point where people in my nation, when in the future they get their first refrigerator, it is powered by clean energy, you have a lot of work to do. And they were right. So the US brought street cred, and part of this, I said, was driven by the markets. Let me just step you through some signals that the market has changed. This is just since 2008. These are data from the US Department of Energy. LED lights. There are now 73 million LED lights estimated that are installed in the United States. Their use has gone up 195 times since 2008 as the price has come down 90%. For solar energy since 2008, the costs have come down at least 60%, more so now because these are 2015 data, and the use has gone up 20 times. For wind started sooner than solar, so although the price has only come down 40%, and is now at parity with natural gas or below natural gas in almost every application, its use has increased 3 times. This is the basis of the clean energy revolution. Paris Agreement, UN stepping up to the plate, and the market taking action. Here is one of my favorite statements from Ben Folk, who was at the White House with me. This is something a statement he's made publicly many times. I'll read it for you in case you can't see in the back. Xcel Energy has brought wind online with prices better, that means cheaper, lower than natural gas. Wind has been pragmatic, cost-effective. So renewable energy beats out fossil fuel. Renewable energy beats out fossil fuel. Still, there are many people who don't know that has happened, who don't know that when companies voluntarily or are forced by regulators to go out on open bids for wind and often for on-peak solar, they're finding that those on-peak solar applications done well, as has happened in Minnesota, come in cheaper than natural gas. Today, actually 3 years ago. So that is why I'm saying clear your head of any remaining 1970s data because the world has utterly changed. So what did the US bring forward? In his first term, President Obama took advantage of a very tough, I think it was actually before he had even been sworn in, when the big 3 auto manufacturers, some of you will remember this, came to Congress and said, we will be going bankrupt and we will not be producing cars in the US anymore unless we get a bailout. Now, they didn't use those words, but that's what they meant. They needed a bailout. And it was perhaps inevitable that they would get money from Congress, from the American taxpayers. But to the credit of a lot of people, including those 3 auto manufacturers, they sat down with the auto unions, the automakers unions, and with President Obama's administration, because somebody raised the point that if there was a bailout coming from Congress, at some point smart taxpayers were going to say, did we get better cars? Right? Did we get better cars? And what they were referring to is, and I used to have such a pain time whenever I would go and talk to a high school class. And I am a big supporter of STEM education, and I want kids to be a part of the progress that is coming, that is already happening. But I was always deathly afraid that some student would point to my graph and say, why did the corporate average fuel economy standards stay the same for 25 years? Not adjusted for anything. They stayed flat for 25 years. And I would sometimes joke with them and say, is it because our engineers didn't get any better for 25 years? Of course not. We're a nation known for engineers going forward. I am from a family of engineers. I know exactly how engineers work. You give them a hard task, you give them a budget and time, and they will deliver on that task. But we had not raised, for only political reasons, the fuel economy standard for 25 years. That changed. It's now in federal law, has been for about 7 years, that by 2025, the average fuel economy will be 54.5 miles per gallon. Double. It will double. So raise your hand if you didn't know that. Before the Clean Power Plan, this was the biggest thing that any nation on earth had ever done to fight global warming. So you don't entirely have to hang your head and stick to the shadows of rooms where international negotiations are going on anymore. because we have taken some action. We brought that to Paris as well, and then we brought the Clean Power Plan that I'll talk about, which is under the Clean Air Act. So a few words about that. Before August 3rd, that date I was at the White House, if you owned a power plant, I went by one on the highway on my way here, a big coal plant. Before August 3rd, that coal plant and every other coal plant could put as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as much waste as they wanted, without any penalty. They weren't breaking any law. Now, meanwhile, they had restrictions on how much mercury, arsenic, cyanide, lead, acid rain precursors they could put up, because that's how the Clean Air Act works. As we get smarter and the scientific and health literature come in and tell us that human health and welfare is being endangered, the Clean Air Act and the EPA have no choice but to limit and lower that pollution over time. But it had not happened for carbon dioxide until 2015. And it was based on a Supreme Court decision back in 2007 that a number of states, and this is where those eastern states are really important, because they have big populations, they have big pension funds like Massachusetts and New York that are heavily invested in energy. And a number of those states came together and sued the EPA. Came to the Supreme Court in 2007. The suit was, climate change is damaging human health and welfare, and you must limit the greenhouse gas emissions. And the EPA agreed with them. The EPA said there's no choice but to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you may note this very big difference between 2007 and 2015 when they actually got limited. That's 8 years. So, although we still hear, there are still complaints at the Supreme Court level, and there are still some complaints from polluters who say that they need time, that they need warning, that they need to put a plan in place. They should have hired better lobbyists in 2007 who could at least read the front page headlines about what the Supreme Court was telling them is the new law of the land. So this has been on the radar screen for a very long time, and fortunately the Clean Air Act, some of you who are here remembers the first Earth Day. I was in grade school. That year, our president was Richard Nixon, a Republican for those of you who don't know, and on December 31st of that year he signed the Clean Air Act. Because of Earth Day, he signed the Clean Air Act. And it had very strong bipartisan support. 91% of senators across this nation voted for it. And it simply says if something is harming human health and welfare, it must be limited and reduced until that harm to human health and welfare is resolved. So we've been working on it for 45, 46 years now. We know how to do this at low cost, and we're going to do it the same thing for carbon dioxide. The Clean Power Plan says that nationally we're going to get about a 32% reduction in carbon from power plants by 2030. Most states, my home state of Minnesota, is working hard to develop our plan to comply with this law. And our limits must be permanent, verifiable, and enforceable. And here's the thing. I was invited to the White House, and Xcel Energy was invited to the White House because Minnesota is already on that trajectory by existing clean energy policy. Already on that trajectory. And the industry, the coal industry knows how to do this, and also knows how to replace coal with clean energy and create a net in Minnesota, just little Minnesota, of 54,000 clean energy jobs that pay on average 41% higher than the state average wage. So there's no trade-off there. You do need to make a transition, but we can get economic development and growth and big carbon reductions. And by the way, Minnesota has had that law in the books since 2007. This is our Next Generation Energy Act. Isn't that a fine name for a law? I didn't name it, I can't tell you who did, but they specifically had in mind kids growing up today and what their energy system would look like. And it requires at least an 80% reduction in carbon by 2050. So like what's happening in Madison and other cities, and in Minnesota it will be across the whole economy, not just electricity. Here are some of the healthcare voices in support of the Clean Power Plan. I'll just read to you what the American Lung Association said in the White House that day. The Clean Power Plan is a tremendous step forward in the U.S. fight against carbon pollution and climate change that will bring immediate health benefits to the American people. Here's why I've been focusing on the power sector more so than other sectors, because it is by far the biggest source of carbon pollution. So we need to make sure that when we make this clean energy transition, we're effectively transitioning off the fossil fuels and getting them out of the way so that we're building all new power. But that won't happen immediately. It shouldn't happen overnight. It shouldn't happen abruptly. That's why we need to get started right away. Here's the other reason that I particularly went to Paris. Because a few months before Paris, here's what one of the biggest Fortune 500 companies based in Minnesota, General Mills, said. I'll read this to you. This is from CEO, his name is Ken Powell. We think that human-caused greenhouse gas causes climate change, and that it's going to stress the agricultural supply chain. Obviously, we depend on that for our business, and we depend on that for the food we eat. He went on, General Mills is committed to doing our part to tackle climate change, and we fully support the effective implementation of the Clean Power Plan. In particular, we applaud the efforts of our home state of Minnesota for the progress its energy officials are making in building a plan that will work cost effectively for families, farmers, municipalities, and the business community alike. No company of the size of General Mills that works in had ever committed, they committed $25 billion, I think, to energy efficiency throughout their supply chain, and they're requiring that all of their supply chain meet carbon reduction standards by 2025. They were also in Paris. And I was at an event that General Mills did in Paris with the Secretary Vilsack from our Department of Agriculture. General Mills was the only entity of those 40 brought 6 farmers to Paris. Should farmers be in a climate change discussion? Of course. And they were so smart, and they were so passionate, and they were talking about ways to build the soil. They were talking about the push on them, not from the government, but the push on water risk and water quality, the very basic of their production. And they were talking about actions that will improve the soil going forward. So we need to make those voices heard. I'm particularly proud of General Mills. Sometimes you can still tell it. I've been in Minnesota many years, but I'm a native of the Hudson River Valley of New York. So when I go around Minnesota and the Midwest, I have something to prove. I'm here because I'm a Minnesotan, I'm a Midwesterner by choice, but I love what General Mills has to say because of the size of their impact and because on my breakfast table in Monroe, New York, General Mills was there. And this is an iconic company, and that changes the entire discussion going forward. And now there are not just General Mills, but lots of businesses who are back a low carbon USA. You can look them up online. Here are some of their logos, some of which I see right over there, Organic Valley. Organic Valley. And I'm sure there are products elsewhere at this fair, probably from Stonyfield Farms, probably from Phillips, probably from JLL, maybe from Johnson & Johnson, of companies who also back this. Now I'm going to step you through, these are American businesses that have pledged to act on climate. I know you can't read all of them, but let me tell you, it's 154 companies and they represent over $4 trillion in annual revenue. This is another big piece in addition to the civic mobilization, in addition to not only Pope Francis, but the leaders of every religious domination on earth who've said climate change is an ethical problem. And here is the Midwestern footprint, some of those companies that I know are also here today. So be proud of that. And then on top of that, we have cities and states taking action. And I want to close with this story from Minnesota. So on top, we have what was the oldest coal plant in Minnesota. It's the Silver Lake plant. It's in Rochester, Minnesota. Anyone know why Rochester, Minnesota is important? Mayo, yes, thank you. Maybe you can see on the bottom, this is an aerial shot of downtown Rochester, Minnesota. And here is the coal plant with a coal pile. I think this photo was taken around 2010. Right around 2007, we got a call in the offices at Fresh Energy from one of our members who was a doctor at the Mayo Clinic. And he said, Jay, we cannot believe it, but the business office of Mayo has signed a contract with the coal plant, which burns coal in downtown Rochester, to provide steam for Rochester, for Mayo Clinic to heat its buildings. And he said, why didn't they consult the medical staff? Are they trying to build future business for us? And so we got engaged with our colleagues at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, who are often our lawyers, to try to stop that from happening. And we lost. That was about 10 years ago. But about almost exactly 2 years ago today, I got a phone call from a reporter in Rochester, Minnesota, who said, Jay, did you know that the utility company here has just voluntarily said that they're going to set a date certain when they'll burn their last lump of coal in the Silver Lake plant? And they made that decision because they were evaluating what is the cost, the real economic cost of buying coal and shipping it by rail from the Powder River Basin going into the future. And they have a special set of costs in Rochester that you may have in your hometown. Rochester is crisscrossed with rail lines to bring that coal in. And if the train is stopped at grade in the city of Rochester, Minnesota, ambulances cannot get through. So they had a very real public controversy about that going forward. So they had other costs. They were weighing it against the expanding and more robust electric grid in the Midwest that includes much more wind, much more solar energy, much more energy efficiency, and they found out they could buy energy from the grid, including wind power that was cheaper than buying coal, and now they are totally off coal. I'll end that story, and I'll begin to wrap up by telling you, a few months later, I was scheduled to speak at the Rotary Club, one of the Rotary Clubs in Rochester, Minnesota. This was the noon Rotary. They met at an auditorium at Mayo. They had a very nice lunch. I didn't have a chance to check before the lunch, but I got up, I got to give a 20-minute talk, and I told that story. And then I said, by chance, is there anyone here from the Rochester Public Utility? And it was the guy sitting in the geographic center of the room who had been frantically writing notes as I, the environmentalist, had been presenting. And I just said, did I get it right? And he stood up and he corroborated my story. He actually had great new tidbits because he had actually made it happen. He got a standing ovation in Rotary. I haven't seen that happen very much. And when you get a standing ovation, most people talk some more. So he went on, and listen to what he said. Listen to what he said when he went on. He said, furthermore, in a healthcare-focused town like Rochester, we couldn't just keep burning coal in 2014. That's part of the clean energy. That's part of the clean energy revolution. So about a month ago, Ben Falk was in your state. He was in Eau Claire for the annual meeting of the shareholders of Xcel Energy, and this is what he said. Coal is going away. It's just a matter of time. Another sign of hope going forward. Now Xcel Energy in my home state of Minnesota, and I hope soon in your state, if they're in your state, has developed a plan with our extreme advocacy to help them move forward to get a 63% reduction in carbon by 2030 and to continue decarbonizing. That's much stronger than the Clean Power Plan, and we need to hold their feet to the fire and make sure that that happens. If that happens, they'll go from 37% coal today to 15% coal by 2030. So I've talked about the Clean Power Plan. I didn't mention that right after Paris, a bipartisan move by Congress, who knew that they could do this? They actually approved something. They approved a budget resolution that included tax credit extensions for wind and solar. And I heard about it when I was in Paris meeting with Secretary of State Kerry. He said to a group of 10 of us, here's what's happening in DC right now. He said, I think this is really going to happen. And I was trying to compute in my head in Paris what this would mean for the economy of the clean energy. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance did it for me. They said it will mean about an additional $73 billion in wind and solar installations by the year 2020. So you can almost calculate, it's only a few dozen months away from now. And this is also what's driving the clean energy revolution. We need to keep it going, and the election still very much matters. But I want to tell you that it's not just these businesses doing these things. And part of the reason I'm going out and talking to you about it is we need more of those original voices telling you what they're doing, so that everyone, not just at a renewable energy fair, knows that these things are possible and are happening, and will insist that they happen in every single state and in every single municipality. I only had one critique. People asked me what it was like in the White House. And I only had one critique that I didn't, of course, express to the president. But he told that group of 300 people, he said, we need to be able to tell, and this is where he got better than he has been in the last 5 years. He used to say, like most people say, we need to do this for future generations. Of course we need to do it for future generations. But the kids that I see running around today, it's their generation. They're very much visible to us. We need to do it for kids growing up today. And so President Obama said on August 3rd last year, we need to be able to tell kids growing up today that we did everything we could on climate change. And he got a standing ovation. But here is what Fresh Energy would like him to say. And here is what we say. And here is how I'm going to end. And when I'm done, I'll be around for the next 20 minutes. And I have business cards. And I hope you'll come to the table in the back, if you'd wave your hand, Dylan, and get some information about Fresh Energy and sign up for a free newsletter so you can find out when these cool things happen and use them in your community. Please do that going forward. Maybe they'll hand some out to you as well. Here is the way I'm going to sum up this whole presentation. Here's what we need to be able to tell those kids growing up today. We need to be able to tell them with a straight face, because it's really happening, starting in 2016, we did everything we could to fight global warming, and it worked. Thank you very much, MREA.